My stepmom's knuckles were still red when the broken pieces of my PS5 stopped sliding across the floor. One shard spun in a slow circle, whining against the tile like it was protesting what had just happened. "You deserved it," my dad said from the doorway, voice flat, like he was commenting on the weather instead of the bruise blooming under my eye. The math test lay crumpled near my shoe, 82%, circled in red, apparently a crime scene exhibit. I didn't cry. I counted. The hum of the ceiling fan. The tick of the kitchen clock. Her breathing, fast, satisfied. She thought the lesson was over. He thought the verdict was final. But silence is a better witness than shouting, and I was already memorizing everything. The smell of her perfume mixed with sweat, the exact angle of the shattered console, the way my father wouldn't look at me. They believed they'd just punished me. They hadn't realized they'd just documented themselves. I'd learned early that in our house, volume decided truth, and I'd never been loud enough to win. My stepmom, Carla, measured love in report cards and obedience. My dad measured peace in how quickly I agreed with her. Before she moved in, he used to quiz me on multiplication tables at the kitchen counter, tapping the table like a metronome and smiling when I got answers right. After she arrived, the tapping stopped. So did the smiling. They called me smart but lazy. The kind of label that sounds harmless until you realize it's a verdict, not an opinion. If I got a 95, they asked about the missing 5. If I stayed quiet, they called it attitude. If I defended myself, they called it disrespect. I started noticing how their stories about me sounded nothing like the person inside my head. At school, teachers said I was observant. At home, they said I was sneaky. Same behavior, different narrator. I kept records without meaning to, dates, words, tones, contradictions, because details felt safer than feelings. People underestimate quiet kids. They assume silence means confusion, not calculation. Carla believed fear would fix me. Dad believed agreement would fix everything. Neither of them understood that I was already learning something far more useful than math. I was learning how evidence works. The house got quieter after the incident, but it wasn't peace, it was surveillance. Carla started watching me the way people watch a stain they're sure will spread. If I opened the fridge, her eyes flicked up from her phone. If I walked past the living room, her voice lowered mid-sentence like my presence required censorship. She never raised her voice again. She didn't have to. Disappointment, delivered softly, cuts deeper. At dinner she'd say things like, "Some kids would be grateful for what they have," while sliding my plate down a few inches harder than necessary. My dad wouldn't look at me. He'd just clear his throat and adjust his fork so it lined up with the table's edge. Agreement by geometry. They began telling stories about me while I was in the room, as if I were a documentary playing in the background. "He has potential," Carla told a neighbor once, her hand resting on my shoulder like a paperweight. "He just lacks discipline." Her fingers pressed slightly when she said lax. I noticed everything. The pause before my name, the careful sighs, the polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. None of it loud. None of it obvious. But tension doesn't need noise to grow. It just needs witnesses. The turning point didn't feel dramatic. It felt precise. It happened third period when my teacher, Mrs. Alvarez, paused mid-sentence while handing back quizzes. Her eyes stopped on my face the way people stare at something they don't want to recognize but already do. She didn't gasp. She didn't accuse. She just tilted her head slightly and asked, soft enough that only I could hear, "Are you safe at home?" For a second, every sound sharpened, the scratch of pencils, a chair leg dragging, someone whispering 2 rows back. I realized she wasn't guessing. She'd already decided something was wrong. The bruise under my eye wasn't hidden. It was evidence waiting to be acknowledged. I could have lied. I'd rehearsed lies for years. But suddenly I understood something Carla and my dad didn't. Silence isn't loyalty. Sometimes it's testimony. So I didn't defend them. I didn't explain. I didn't rush. I just met her eyes and said, calm and clear, "I don't think I am." That was it. No speech. No tears. Just truth placed carefully between us like a document being signed. By the end of the day, the office called me in. By the next morning, someone else was asking questions. Planning didn't look like revenge. It looked like patience with a purpose. The counselor spoke gently, but her questions were structured, almost architectural. Dates, frequency, witnesses, objects used, exact wording. I recognized the pattern because I'd seen it before in science labs and math proofs. Claims mean nothing without verifiable steps. So I gave her steps. Not emotions. Not guesses. Facts. I told her when the yelling started. When it turned into grabbing. When objects started breaking. I described the Ps5 last, the way you save the strongest evidence for the conclusion. She nodded and wrote everything down in block letters, each word deliberate, like it might be read aloud someday. That afternoon she explained documentation. How reports work, how statements are compared, how inconsistencies matter. Credentials lined her wall. Degrees, certifications, proof she understood systems better than Carla understood intimidation. I listened the way I listened to instructions before a test. At home, I didn't act different. Same quiet footsteps. Same neutral answers. Same lowered eyes. They thought nothing had changed. But now there was a record that didn't live in my head. And records, unlike memories, don't get shouted over. The knock came at 9:12 a.m., 3 measured taps that sounded official even before the door opened. I was at the table with my notebook, pencil resting exactly where I'd left it, when Carla walked past me to answer it. She smoothed her hair first. Presentation mattered to her. 2 people stood outside. Calm faces. Clipboards. Neutral shoes. Their voices were polite, almost gentle, which somehow made Carla's smile tighten. I watched from my chair as her posture shifted, confidence draining in slow increments while they introduced themselves and asked if they could come in. My dad hovered behind her, already nodding before anyone finished a sentence, the way he always agreed with whoever sounded most certain. They didn't look at me right away. They looked around. The room. The walls. The floor. Observers cataloging a scene. Questions followed, each one simple, each one requiring a precise answer. Dates. Incidents. Discipline methods. Carla laughed lightly at first, like it was all a misunderstanding. But laughter fades when it isn't echoed. When they finally turned to me, I didn't perform. I didn't accuse. I just confirmed. Truth, spoken quietly, carries farther than shouting ever could. And for the first time, the silence in that house wasn't theirs. By evening, the house felt unfamiliar, like a set after filming wraps. Lights off, props exposed, illusion gone. Carla didn't slam cabinets or lecture. She sat rigid on the couch, fingers locked together, her eyes following the carpet pattern as if it might rearrange into a solution. My dad kept pacing, stopping every few steps to sigh, the sound thin and uncertain without authority behind it. Phone calls replaced accusations. Low voices. Careful wording. I caught fragments drifting down the hallway. Misunderstanding. Cooperating. Of course we care. The same man who once said I deserved it now sounded like someone pleading a case he hadn't prepared for. No one looked at me directly. Not out of anger, out of calculation. For the first time they were measuring me. I realized then the stakes had never just been bruises or a broken console. It was credibility. Narrative. Who gets believed when stories collide? People think revenge is destruction, something loud and explosive. But what actually changes lives is evidence, calmly placed where it can't be ignored. That's why this mattered, because somewhere out there is another quiet kid memorizing details instead of fighting back, wondering if silence means powerlessness. It doesn't. Sometimes silence is simply strategy waiting for its moment. In the weeks that followed, nothing changed quickly, but everything changed permanently. Meetings replaced lectures. My name appeared on schedules, reports, folders. Adults spoke to me, not about me. I answered the same way I always had, calm, precise, factual. It turned out composure wasn't a weakness like Carla claimed. In the right room, it was authority. My dad tried small kindnesses, the cautious kind you offer a stray animal you're afraid might bolt. Extra food on my plate. Quiet questions about school. I didn't reject him, but I didn't rush to meet him either. Trust, I'd learned, isn't repaired with apologies. It's rebuilt with consistency, like solving for X step by step. Carla stopped narrating my flaws out loud. Not because she'd changed, but because someone else might be listening. I felt lighter, though nothing about my life was easier. There were still forms, conversations, decisions ahead. But the difference was simple and absolute. I wasn't invisible inside my own story anymore. People think justice arrives like thunder. For me, it arrived like proof, clear, quiet, undeniable. And once the truth was written down, it never had to raise its voice again.